Hello, my name is Juliet. I'm a coordinator with the One Democratic State Initiative. Today I'm speaking with Sam, a journalist and solidarity activist. It's very nice to have you, Sam. Can you maybe introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Like you said, my name is Sam Stein. Um, I am Jewish. I grew up in New York in a very right-wing religious Orthodox Zionist family and community, and really grew up with that as sort of the standard and background for my whole life. Um, my family would go on vacation to Israel all the time when I was a kid to sort of visit cousins and family and for Jewish holidays and stuff like that. And that was always my experience with it. I didn't know anything about kind of the reality of Zionism. I never thought about Palestinians, never thought about sort of really anything. Any time it came up was just kind of, oh, some rabbi of mine would rant about how they just want to kill us. Never said Palestinians, it was always just Arab. They really completely erased Palestinian identity. And then when I was 18, after I finished high school, I did a gap year in sort of in army prep program. It's called Mechina in Hebrew. In a settlement, in a settlement called Efrat, and I had no idea what that meant at the time. The first time I ever remember hearing the phrase "the green line" was after signing up for this program. A friend of mine said, "Ooh, pass the green line, such a good Zionist." And that was all I knew. I didn't know what it meant. I just knew that there was some line and I was past it, and that was a good thing. And kind of even for that entire year, knew that I was in a place that was considered different, but didn't really know how or why. I knew that I saw more Arabs, kind of, again, we never said Palestinian, around me than compared to my twin brother who studied in a sort of Jewish study school, yeshiva in Beit Shemesh in Israel slash the 48 territories. Um, but didn't know why or like as far as I was concerned, there was no actual difference. There was this checkpoint that nobody really explained to me that we went past. There were definitely things that I saw over that year that didn't sit right with me. I kind of always was more liberal and progressive than my upbringing in my community, but never had the language to express it. And I remember seeing the checkpoint that we would drive through. There was something weird to me about the fact that it was only in one direction. It was only when you were leaving the West Bank that there was even any mechanism to check you, not that they ever checked us. And something that was a little more salient was the different license plates. That like really, really bothered me. And the fact that Palestinians had different license plates, especially as an American, it really, really reminded me of sort of American Jim Crow and segregation. And I remember a rabbi of mine complaining about Jews and Israelis having limited access to the Temple Mount and saying Israel is occupied by Arabs. So that kind of is the doublespeak that I was raised on. I was raised on a complete Zionist one state reality. I lived in the West Bank for a year and had no idea that that was sort of a different thing, that was a different political entity, and went through that whole experience and kind of left with no deeper understanding of Zionism or of the 67 occupation, forget things like the Nakba and a deeper understanding of how this all came to be. And I got to college. I kind of was able to explore more liberal and progressive thought in general. Trump's rise to power in the US really sort of woke me up politically, especially seeing all of my childhood authority figures and role models completely rallying behind him and being so in full support of him really, really shook me and woke me up. You know, this man that like every single word out of his mouth was kind of so obviously horrible to me. And a good friend of mine also kind of began talking about the occupation a lot and being much more sort of critical of Israel and Zionism and the narrative that we were raised on. And that was the first time that I sort of was hearing this rhetoric from another Jewish person, from one of my best friends who also grew up Orthodox, who is to this day still religious and still very observant. And that was when I was kind of like, oh, I need to think about this stuff. And didn't know where I would fall on it, just knew I need to find out. I need to kind of like dig deeper and kind of pretty quickly accepted that the narrative that I was raised on was missing something.
Mm.
And on that journey, I guess, I remember towards the end of college, this Palestinian guy, you know, another college student, 20, 21, 22, came to speak at the Hunter Hillel, the kind of Jewish culture club in Hunter College, where I went to New York. You might be familiar with Hillel. It's kind of this massive international network of Jewish culture clubs that is unfortunately also very, very Zionist, but in a more sort of masked, apoliticized, quasi-liberal way. Um, though because of the student body in mind, we were able to, you know, some students, I would say, were able to really push the envelope a little more to the point that we had a Palestinian come and speak. And I remember him mentioning that he was from Beit Lechem, which was right next to Efrat, the settlement that I lived in. And that really, really humanized him for me at the time. It just really made things very real. And I remember very naively thinking, oh, we were neighbors. You know, as if we could really be neighbors with this giant wall in between us. And I went to Rachel's tomb on my gap year program. We more than once kind of as settlers on those like settler pilgrimages that you might be familiar with, had the army escort us into Bethlehem to pray at Rachel's tomb. And bizarrely, that also brought it home for me. I was still like, oh, you know, it was in this absurd militaristic colonial way, but I had been inside the city of Bethlehem before. And I don't remember his name. I don't remember what he spoke about even. All I remember is that almost in passing, he mentioned needing to kind of get a permit from Israel to go into Jordan to fly to the US to get to college. That was how he had to get to New York to begin university, because obviously he couldn't fly through Ben Gurion. And I remember just being like, wait, what? Like I hopped on a plane, landed, and walked around like I owned the place. Like wasn't born there, you know, just kind of showed up. And even kind of had this really dumb incident where I accidentally, during my gap year, I went back to New York for my sister's wedding in like December and I came back in and there was some mistake with my student visa and I basically wasn't, unbeknownst to me, wasn't on a student visa and I'd accidentally overstayed a tourist visa for like a month or two and then left and came back. And they even like saw that and kind of told me about it. We're just like, it's fine, just get it taken care of. So I had that experience that like even at, you know, at the time, kind of still in that world, still on this completely one-sided narrative, was just like, oh, that was because I am Jewish and Orthodox and wearing a kippah and look the way I look. And then the contrast, you know, that with this Palestinian man story and hearing him talk about these checkpoints that were a game to us. We would drive into Jerusalem and go through the checkpoint and just think like, what's the dumbest song we can like blast full volume to like get a laugh out of the soldiers? Um, and that checkpoint was so real to him and everything else. I just remember thinking to myself, oh, that's apartheid. at a time when I think that word was definitely still controversial for me, and I think sort of broadly really not as readily accepted as it is today, certainly in, since the ongoing genocide, where there have literally been court cases and like massive, massive NGOs coming out and saying, no, this is apartheid. And that was definitely sort of the beginning of the end in terms of my analysis of what was going on. Like that was when I was like kind of after that, it all sort of one by one came into place. But I really wanted to spend more time in that land, and I applied to grad school, and I basically ended up going to Tel Aviv University. And certainly at the time didn't know that Tel Aviv University itself is a Nakba site. Um, and I decided to go, and I kind of knew that I couldn't just go and hang out on the beach and like take grad school classes. I right away knew I wanted to be doing like real activism. Didn't really know what that would look like. Wasn't an activist in the US, but kind of just threw myself into things. I got in touch with a group called All That's Left, which is basically a group of international Jews living in Palestine and in 48 and in engaging in solidarity activism in sort of a lot of different capacities. It's very big tent. A lot of people sort of educate, organize educational events and protests and things like that. A lot of people are going into the West Bank way more often and joining shepherds and Palestinian shepherds and farmers and documenting settler violence and military violence and arrests and home demolitions. And that's the side of things that I very quickly landed on. Pretty quickly ended up going into the West Bank at least once or twice a week, very often staying the night, very specifically going to Masafer Yatta, the now famous site of No Other Land. And I heard about this project that was in the works. This was 2020. It was during COVID when there were no internationals around really and nobody could get in. And the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, an organization that had done a ton of work on the ground of bringing international Jews in to engage in solidarity, asked the Palestinian activists that they were in touch with, again, mostly Masafer Yatta, now with COVID and with everything so the way it is, how do you want us to help? And so we need people to come for a long time because nobody can come in for a week or two anymore. So they thought of this program called Hinenu, which is Hebrew for we are here. And on Hinenu, activists would live in Masafer Yatta for 3 months straight, kind of go back to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or whatever every other weekend or so, but live there 3 months of just constant protective presence, documenting every single thing that happens, joining shepherds, joining farmers, whatever it is. And I heard about it and I was like, wow, that's incredible. That is like so amazing and subversive, and there's no way I'm crazy enough to do that. And then I did it, so I guess I was wrong. And that was in 2021. And then in May 2021, sort of the last, high profile war between Israel and Gaza, where Palestine was sort of capturing the news cycle. I was attacked by settlers. And me and one other activist were attacked by 3 or 4 settlers, and they broke my phone, and they, swung a club at my head and at my knee, and the other activist, much older, he's 70 something, was hit in the back of the head and actually needed to go to the hospital. And I called the police and reported it, and then I was arrested and interrogated and eventually banned from the West Bank for 2 weeks. And it feels weird to say because at this point I'd already decided to live in Masafer Yatta for 3 months, but that really kind of felt like the moment of this is your life now. Like you are an activist. That is who you are. There's no going back. And after that, I kind of during the day did a few different stuff. I worked at an NGO for a bit and was a freelance journalist for a long time and all this other stuff, but really the through line was constantly going into the West Bank, mostly Masafer Yatta, sometimes also in the Jordan Valley in the northern region of the West Bank, and just doing protective presence, joining shepherds, um, staying overnight, documenting everything, and writing about it and posting about it on social media and trying to raise awareness as much as possible. I think really because of my upbringing, the awareness raising aspect has always really, really resonated with me. I know that people can be reached because it happened to me. I know that people's minds can be changed because I changed my mind. And that kind of started, as me posting on Facebook to people I grew up with and then posting on Instagram to like 500 people. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then October 7th happened. And then the ongoing genocide started. And Palestine became sort of the news story. Um, and things on the ground became, escalated to a point that none of us really thought was possible. And then I kind of, for a long time, wasn't able to spend nearly as much time in the West Bank as I had come to be used to, but was still going in fairly often. And then kind of fast forwarding in August of last year, I got hired by an organization called Rabbis for Human Rights as their field coordinator in Masafer Yatta. My job became to be what I was already doing, which was to organize protective presence and bring in activists and, just do protective presence in Masafer Yatta. So I spoke to a few friends of mine in Masafer Yatta in a village called Al Khair and asked if it would be helpful if I moved there and just lived there full time. And they, very quickly and emphatically said, yes, absolutely. So in September, I kind of threw everything I owned in the back of my car and I drove down and I moved in. And I ended up there for 6 months, a little over 6 months. So, half a year. And when it started, I knew it would be at least 3 months. Definitely kind of didn't really have a plan. It was just kind of as long as it goes. And yet during that experience, kind of course, got closer with the whole community that I was already close with, or even, kind of the people that I wasn't interacting with so much. And just seeing every single bit of just living full life in the village, not kind of only through one specific lens as an activist. And also, really right away, saw how quickly soldiers started recognizing me, settlers started recognizing me, especially as my online platform got bigger and bigger. Settlers started calling me by my Instagram name. I think they think like on Instagram I'm Sam Abraham, and they think that my last name is Abraham, which is funny. It's not as my middle name, and I already knew this, but to live it directly was so crystallizing that they felt so strongly A, confused and B, threatened by my existence, by my presence in the area and by my living in this village and just being a Jewish guy living in full community with Palestinians, one with Israeli citizenship. And that really was just like so affirming to everything I do. If the soldiers and settlers hated this much, then I'm doing something right. And it really felt just undermining the whole thing. Like the whole entire structure of the whole apartheid system is just that apartheid. It's separation. It's they don't want us to be friends. They want a very specific tokenized symbol of friendship so that you can pretend it's not apartheid. So you can say, but my pharmacist is Palestinian. They don't want us actually caring about each other deeply and hearing and seeing what it's like to be Palestinian and having to go about our regular day with that knowledge.
Mm,
And, even kind of people will say, "Oh, well, weren't you just a settler? You were an Israeli citizen living in Palestinian land." And like, no, I was a guest. I spoke about this. Communicated this with members of the community and was invited. And the reaction I got made it so incredibly clear that it was hurting the settler project, not helping it. And yeah, that is kind of where I'm coming from right now. I've actually just left Palestine after 6 years, and I'm living in Boston and kind of trying to figure out what my next steps are. I only got here just about a month ago, so really, really, it's wild, reverse culture shock, and incredibly bizarre to say the least to be back. I was in a local meeting of Somerville for Palestine, and people are talking about petitions and canvassing and votes and all this stuff. And I'm like, I got kidnapped by the IDF a month ago. Like, how is that what we're talking about right now? I don't want to knock that stuff because it works and it matters, but it definitely kind of, the shell shock that I'm experiencing.
mm, mm. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of this. It's a very impressive evolution. Also, so before I move ahead with some of the questions, I just wanted to confirm. So, in the end, you mentioned that do you have an Israeli citizenship yourself?
Yeah.
Okay, and how currently how do you navigate this? Is it something that you're comfortable with? Um, do you see it as a tool, maybe?
Yeah, definitely. I was arrested multiple times while doing this activism and was able to go through that knowing that like I can't get deported.
Mm, yeah. Okay.
And I
Uh,
had Palestinian friends that were like very grateful that I had that
yeah.
privilege and protection.
Mm,
So definitely know that it's a sensitive topic and you know, that's
mm,
definitely my relationship to it.
mm. Okay. Um, Yeah, I want to talk a bit more about this question of also the identities, and as you said, how you are a threat for settlers and for soldiers. But before, I wanted to ask you, because of this very strong evolution from your upbringing until where you are today, how is this? How is it received? How did you experience it at the personal level in relation to your own identity, and how was it received and perceived by the people around you?
Yeah, I think on my end it felt so gradual that it's kind of there was definitely in the earliest stages, I remember really pushing back against my friend a lot, the one who kind of was the first person I ever heard speaking out against this stuff. I remember I found old text of ours like a while ago where I'm like really giving all of the classic Zionist answers, which was really bizarre and funny. When I'm like, oh, they're terrorists and this and that, and we offered. So that was funny and a little rough to see, a little embarrassing for, 19-year-old Sam, whatever it was. Um, I think for a lot of my family and sort of people I grew up with, it kind of at first. they thought it was like almost a phase, or just like, oh, Sam's like looking into the other side, and it's like this kooky thing that will go away. And then it kept going and going, and obviously didn't go away. And I think that's when it kind of started to get more pushback, but eventually sort of wrapped around of anyone really close to me and anybody really kind of talking to me throughout this whole process can't deny what I've seen and what I've experienced and that I know what I'm talking about.
Mm,
So, unfortunately, that doesn't mean that every single person that I've maintained a connection with has like turned on a dime, but there's definitely become some sort of acceptance that like the prevailing rhetoric that we grew up on is that kind of any anti-Zionist, especially Jewish anti-Zionists and Jewish leftists, must not know what they're talking about. They must just like not actually understand what's actually happening, or they would never think these things. And that's pretty impossible to say about me. So that I think really got some people close to me to at least try and listen to me. Like I said, it's not that they've all kind of become card carrying anti-Zionists overnight. And there are definitely also people from my upbringing, especially post October 7th, that I just like can't really talk to anymore. It's just too frustrating and difficult. And, I kind of say not with a bang, but with a whimper. I didn't get into any like screaming arguments with people and have them yell at me and say, "You're dead to me. I never want to talk to you again." It's just that there's some people that it's too exhausting to talk to. Um, and I had like did have like one or two people kind of like, you know, message me obnoxious stuff after October 7th, but nobody that I was friends with in the first place, just kind of like random people that I haven't spoken to since high school. And I'm just like, bro, who are you? How did you find my Instagram? And my shul, the synagogue that I went to as a child, just hosted Ben-Gvir, Itamar Ben-Gvir, to speak while he was in the US. So that's kind of where we're coming from. And obvious, I never go back. My parents aren't even there anymore, so there's no reason for me to go back. Yeah, the vast majority of kind of my friends and social circles are not from that world anymore.
mm, mm. Yeah, thank you for sharing this. Going back to what you were uh, speaking before about this question of the identities and this I don't know, maybe you want to develop a bit more about um, how and why does it make sense to you, and how and why is it a threat that yourself as a Jew and as an Israeli citizen would be fighting hand in hand with Palestinians?
Yeah, definitely. I think, right, I was told my entire life that um peace, I guess, or coexistence or whatever is impossible. I was told that if I went into a Palestinian community, I would be killed. We saw the big red signs that Israel puts out Area A. We would drive past those all the time, and they would say like, "Oh, look, see those signs? Like, don't go to those places, you'll get killed." And I'm doing it. It's that simple. Like that's the narrative that I was raised on. I remember once on my gap year, we took a wrong turn and ended up in some Palestinian village. And that was like the most scary and exciting thing that ever happened to us because we thought that was actually dangerous. Meanwhile, now I know that those villagers were probably terrified that they probably thought that like a bunch of settlers were about to attack. Um, and yeah, I'm just showing with my body, I'm putting kind of my money where my mouth is and just showing with my actions that it's not true and not just in my not just in Masafer Yatta, just my entire life, especially since October 7th, I was spending way more time with Palestinians than with Israelis. Like living in going I do martial arts and I was doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in this Palestinian gym in Shuafat. And then I would go to practice with them in different gyms in Ramallah. And I was going into the city of Yatta for just like groceries and car repair and stuff like that. And I have friends, Jewish friends that had an apartment, live in Beit Lechem and have an apartment in Beit Lechem because that's where they wanted to live. So just, it pulls out the entire narrative right away. And it's funny because they still do it. So many settlers, while attacking me, while yelling at me and harassing me, say, oh, they're going to kill you. These people in this village, like the second they're done with you, when they decide to kill us all, you're first, you're closest. I'm like, you're attacking me right now. Um, I'm, a month or two ago, I was attacked and blindfolded and zip tied by a few soldiers that thought I was Palestinian. I was going to my car and they asked me what I was doing, and they eventually attacked me and tied me up and threw me into this base nearby and threatened to kill me more than once. And then by the time we got into the base, they look at my ID and hear me speak and some other stuff, and they eventually find out that I'm not Palestinian and that I'm Jewish. One of them said, "Oh, I think he's Jewish. His name is Shmuel, the Hebrew version of Sam, and he speaks Hebrew." And while they were handing me over to the police to be arrested, one of them, he said this more than once, but he says, "Oh, the Arab, you're a traitor, and the Arabs don't like traitors. You're the first one they're gonna kill." And I'm like, "You threatened to kill me an hour ago. Like, you were the one attacking me. Like I've been doing this work for 6 years with people that constantly, telling friends and family from back home what I'm doing and where I'm going. And they tell me to stay safe. And I'm like, do you mean from Palestinians or from settlers? Because one of those things is an actual threat. And yeah, I'm just trying to show firsthand that it doesn't have to be this way, and that the Zionist lie is that this is the only way that Jews can be safe.
Mm. I, I find it interesting because what you describe is of your own practice of the land, and the relationship with your friend and the different friendships, and co I mean, coexisted is very weak as a word in this case, but like you're actually living next to and with Palestinian communities. It illustrates what we speak about when we speak about one democratic state where identities are not politicized, which is what we do a lot with this initiative. Um, I I also remember that in the beginning of this interview, when you introduce yourself, you mentioned that when you were in this gap year, um, you were practicing the land as one state, but one Zionist, one Jewish state. So I I find this change interesting, and I remember that when we discussed before, you also mentioned that at one point if I remember well, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that there was this evolution from one to two back to one state. Can you maybe speak a bit about this and what is your vision today?
Yeah, definitely. So the switch to two states kind of just went hand in hand with me unlearning the upbringing, the narrative that I was raised on. And once I embraced kind of more progressive and liberal schools of thought, I just kind of right away was like, oh, well, the whole more liberal establishment is talking about two states. That has to be the one that's right. And I definitely think I internalized this notion that it was one ethno state or another. I think that was something that got me. I was like, oh, well, no ethno states. So, um, and I pretty quickly I never focused on it too much, I would say, but really right away, especially when I became active, when I was on the ground and like joining these activist groups, um, none of my friends, like none of my Israeli and Jewish friends supported two states, and definitely are not like dying on that hill. I remember at a point where I was like maybe figuring that out still more, but I remember we were at this protest, this, you know, is this like left-wing anti-Zionist Israeli protest in Jerusalem that I don't remember exactly what it was about. I think it was that a border cop killed a Palestinian, which unfortunately I can't even remember what all these protests are about. And this is in 2019. And we're marching, we're chanting, we're in like the heart of Jerusalem and like a really Kahanist area, like kind of where all of the hilltop youth hang out when they're when they're in Jerusalem for a weekend and getting drunk. And there's this one chant that comes up, Shte Medinot L'Shnei Amim, two states for two people. And all my friends were like, let's skip that one. The other ones were fine. And I was like, huh. I remember being like, that's interesting. I want to learn more about this and kind of, you know, also more gradual, just it started to make the most sense to me, especially I learned about the Federation model and some other stuff and really kind of learned about sort of the Palestinian, you know, I don't want to make the Palestinian community monolith, but like the overwhelming consensus of Palestinian community that two states is already this ceding to a massive injustice and legitimizing the Nakba and, you know, um, cementing the colonization and the expulsion that has happened um, before and since 48. And kind of selfishly, like to be like perfectly honest, like selfishly, it started to make more sense to me. Part of me was like, I don't want two states. I don't want these walls and these separations and these barriers. I want to visit my friends and go to Ramallah and go to the beach in Tel Aviv. And I want my friends in Masafer Yatta to just like come to Jerusalem and visit me, instead of me being the one that goes there all the time because I'm the one that can go through checkpoints. Um, and yeah, that kind of just clicked. It just like the more I learned about it and thought about it, the more it seemed so obvious. And even in sort of the people clinging to a two-state solution are like grappling with this massive elephant in the room that they know it's impossible with the settlement project and with the reality on the ground in the West Bank. There is no um real contiguous Palestinian state that's viable in the West Bank. So this is the only option left. And like thankfully I think it's the better option, but kind of coming from that perspective of like, oh well, everyone thinks that this is impossible anyway. So maybe we need to just like stop kidding ourselves. And, I definitely think that that's also what sort of the movement is missing is that the people that support two states are saying two states over and over and over and over again. And then the kind of like more radical, progressive, left wing, whatever you want to call them, the people that support one democratic state don't say it. They talk about, they will call out the atrocities on the ground and even attack or hold Israel accountable even within 48 more and push the envelope in a lot of important ways and then just not say one democratic state.
Mm. Yeah, that's true. That's actually also interesting that you mentioned this because it's kind of the constatation that the initiative comes from to say, okay, now we need to put this on the table and for it to become almost mainstream, that people can refer to it as a solution, as opposed to not saying anything, so that we keep everybody um, as a potential um, target or something. Um, it's you mentioned the fact that it was almost selfish to support one state because of this the doors that are open by it being fully open. Is it a sentiment that is shared that from your experience and your relationships in Israel? Is it a sentiment that is shared that regardless what state it is, as long as it's one state, it can be accepted?
Um, Overall, I wouldn't say so. There definitely, ironically, is sort of like when Israel put up the apartheid wall, the two groups that were kind of opposing it were the far left that, saw it for what it was, and the settler movement that was like you're cutting off, parts of Eretz Israel, of the land of Israel, of the Holy Land. Like, no, it's supposed to be one whole thing. Like, what are you doing? Um, Obviously none of that came from like any sort of concern for Palestinians, but that was definitely the irony at play. And I think kind of just yeah, I think a lot of my friends would probably basically agree with what I said. And that there are a lot of people that talk about in different ways that talk about how the status quo is not safe or healthy or thriving for Jews or Israelis. So that's kind of what is really, really salient to me. And it's true and needs to be mentioned. And also, of course, the people that are actually facing massive injustice are Palestinians, and that's what we should be focusing on. But it's definitely also not good for Jews.
Mm, yeah, and so it's going with what you said, or you can go in completely other direction. What would be your message for Israelis today?
Sorry, what was that?
Um, what would be your message to Israelis today?
Um, I think to just look around, no one's happy. There's not, no matter how, it's not only the sort of radical left-wing anti-Zionist Israelis that think that this is unacceptable and that, this can't go on. There's not a single person between the river and the sea who likes the status quo. So at a certain point, you just have to ask yourself, we've been trying the same thing for, basically since the Second Intifada is when the occupation and the regime really became what it is today. And we've been trying this for 25, 26, coming up on 30 years. It has been a resounding failure.
Mm,
Give something else a shot. People have, for years, for literally decades, Netanyahu was able to maintain support on this talking point that was never true, but this talking point that prevailed, that he makes people feel safe, that he's good on security. And we can now see that that was a colossal failure. He managed to kick the can down the road. He managed to lengthen the fuse on a ticking time bomb for, you know, 20 years, but then it all blew up. So people this is true, I think, of right wingers everywhere. It's certainly true in Israel, but people call leftists naive. Like that is the insult reserved for leftists, that they're naive. And to that, I just have to say that you're the ones who've been trying the same thing forever and it's not working. So maybe let's give my naive human rights thing a try.
yeah, thank you. Um, a bit in line with what you were saying, I wanted to ask, what what do you think of the demonstrations that we see in Israel today?
Um, it's pretty, it's part of a long history, I guess, of, going back to before October 7th when there were the massive protests happening against the Israeli judicial reform. Um, of these protests that of kind of critiques of the government and of the current government and the ruling government in place that just falls flat and doesn't kind of mention Palestinian suffering. And I want to, definitely take a second to say that there is always a block within the protests that does do that. Before October 7th, after October 7th, I've been in that block. My like really good friends of mine are very active in that sort of block of the protests. And those protests are important, and that's why we show up, and that's why we make sure to go and platform, to try and raise Palestinian voices and shine a light on what is actually happening, what's actually important. Um, it's a step, it's a start, it's Israelis are fed up with the war slash genocide for not all of the right reasons, let's say. I don't want to say the wrong reasons, but definitely not the right reasons either. And they got there. It's not, we want them to also care about the atrocities happening to Palestinians in Gaza, but the fact that it's part of the process, the fact that there is this massive just fed upness and rejection of the war in Israeli society is a good thing. And there are massive frustrations that we need to grapple with about why, but we're still gonna capitalize on that and push it forward and hope that it gets people to, where we want them to be.
Mm, yeah. Um, Before we finish, can you also maybe share your message to Palestinians?
Um, we're here, like real anti-Zionist Jews and Israelis exist, and there are people that, like, to the strongest extent want this to end and want freedom and liberation and right of return for Palestinians and are willing to do what it takes to get there, willing to give up the privilege that we have to make that happen. And understandably, not a lot of Palestinians, I think, don't necessarily realize that. And it's our job to help them realize that. And I think that in its own right is it will be such a massive step.